In a quiet corner of town, where the hum of engines and idle chatter filled the air, a group of bikers lingered near a diner parking lot, their presence as loud as their motorcycles. They watched with sneers and side comments as a lone black man stepped out of his car, his posture calm, his gaze steady. Their eyes followed his every move, whispers turning to snickers, then to something bolder, a challenge laced with mockery. To them, he didn't belong here. To them, he was nothing more than a target, a momentary diversion for their misplaced bravado. But what they didn't realize was that this man wasn't just passing through. He wasn't someone they could intimidate, no easy prey for their taunts. Behind his composed demeanor lay a lifetime of unyielding discipline, forged in environments far more hostile than any parking lot. Each step he took carried a weight they couldn't begin to understand. What was meant to be their act of dominance was about to meet an unshakable force, and in a matter of moments, their assumptions and their arrogance would shatter in ways they could never have anticipated. To understand the man in that parking lot, we have to step back to where it all began, Jacksonville, North Carolina. Born and raised in a small, close-knit community, Kelvin Cole was no stranger to hardship. The youngest of 3 children, Kelvin grew up in a modest home where his parents worked tirelessly to provide a better life. His father, a retired Marine, instilled in him a sense of discipline and resilience. His mother, a teacher, emphasized the importance of education and standing tall in the face of adversity. But growing up in the South wasn't without its challenges. From an early age, Kelvin encountered the sharp edges of prejudice. He remembered the way store clerks followed him as a boy, the whispers in school hallways, the uneasy stares when he walked into certain neighborhoods. By the time he reached his teens, the reality of being treated differently because of his skin color had carved a deep resolve within him. He refused to let those who underestimated him define his potential. It was during high school that Kelvin found his inspiration. His father's stories of service and camaraderie as a Marine lit a fire in him. But Kelvin didn't just want to follow in his father's footsteps. He wanted to go further, to push beyond what others believed he could achieve. He set his sights on one of the most elite units in the military, the Navy SEALs. The path was anything but easy. At 18, Kelvin enlisted in the Navy, where he quickly stood out for his focus and determination. But when he reached SEAL training, infamous for its brutal demands, he faced challenges that went beyond the physical. As one of the few black candidates in his cohort, Kelvin dealt with moments of isolation and doubt, the whispered skepticism of whether he truly belonged. Still, he endured. Through sheer willpower, Kelvin excelled in every test, from grueling underwater drills to 20-hour endurance exercises that pushed his body to the brink. By the end of the training, he had earned his place, not just as a Navy SEAL, but as a symbol of defying limits. His achievement wasn't just for himself. It was for every young boy like him who had ever been told they couldn't. Kelvin Cole had become one of the most skilled and respected warriors in the Navy. But to him, it was only the beginning of a lifelong mission to break barriers and prove what was possible. Now, years later, Kelvin carried that same quiet strength wherever he went. Whether in uniform or not, he moved through the world with the confidence of a man who had faced and conquered both the seen and unseen battles. And on this particular day, in a small-town parking lot, he would need every ounce of that strength. After months of intense deployments and rigorous schedules, Kelvin Cole found himself with a rare day off. He decided to take a peaceful drive, staying close to familiar surroundings in Jacksonville, North Carolina. His journey brought him to Brookhaven, a small, quiet town just on the outskirts of the city. Brookhaven was the kind of place that seemed frozen in time, an old gas station with a single pump, a weathered diner where locals gathered over coffee, and streets lined with oak trees that whispered stories of generations past. But beneath the town's picturesque exterior lay the remnants of a complicated history. Brookhaven, like many small southern towns, carried scars of racial divides that had yet to fully fade. Generations of systemic inequities had created an unspoken but ever-present tension that lurked in the way people interacted. The population was mostly white, with a small black community who had lived here for decades, often carving out lives of quiet dignity while navigating the unspoken boundaries that still lingered. Kelvin pulled his car into the dusty parking lot of the diner. The engine's hum faded, and in its place, a curious silence took over. As he stepped out, his footsteps seemed to echo louder than they should have. A pair of men standing near their pickup truck glanced in his direction, their casual conversation halting briefly as their eyes lingered. Inside the diner, the faint chime of the doorbell drew the attention of a waitress wiping down the counter. Her movements slowed just enough to be noticeable as she glanced out at him. It wasn't hostility outright, but there was something in the air. It was a look Kelvin had grown familiar with over the years, a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, an unspoken question of why he was here and whether he belonged. For Kelvin, this was nothing new. He had learned to carry himself with quiet strength in places like these, to let his presence speak louder than any words. But Brookhaven wasn't just another small town, and today wasn't going to be just another day. Unbeknownst to Kelvin, the simple act of parking his car and stepping out into this town had already drawn attention. For some, his calm and confident demeanor was enough to unsettle the fragile norms they had grown comfortable with. And in the moments to come, those quiet glances would give way to actions that no one would soon forget. In Brookhaven, there was a group of men whose presence could be felt before they were even seen. The locals called them the Iron Bandits, a group of bikers who had made the town and its outskirts their unofficial territory. With their rumbling engines and leather jackets adorned with crude insignias, they were hard to miss. The leader of the group, Clint was a man whose reputation preceded him. Tall, broad, and always wearing a smirk that carried more arrogance than charm, Clint thrived on intimidation. He had lived in Brookhaven his entire life and had built his authority not through respect, but through fear. The Iron Bandits weren't just a group of men who loved motorcycles. For years, they had operated on an unspoken set of rules, making it clear who was welcome in their spaces and who wasn't. They spent their evenings in the corner booth of the local bar, their mornings at the diner, and their afternoons in parking lots, like the one Kelvin Cole had just entered. Wherever they went, they cast a shadow, their loud voices and territorial behavior acting as a warning to anyone they deemed an outsider. For Clint, it wasn't just about maintaining control, it was about upholding what he believed was his right. To him, Brookhaven belonged to men like him, and anyone who challenged that, whether directly or indirectly, became a target. Over the years, the Iron Bandits had developed a reputation for making their point clear. For the black residents of the area, encounters with the group meant enduring thinly veiled insults, passive-aggressive remarks, or worse. These men weren't subtle in their actions, but their ability to toe the line without crossing it too blatantly meant they often evaded real consequences. Among the group were Clint's closest followers, Ray, a wiry man with a quick temper, Joel, whose size made him a physical threat, and Mason, the youngest of the crew, who seemed eager to prove himself in whatever way he could. Together, they formed a pack that fed off each other's energy, their bravado increasing when they were in numbers. They saw themselves as the town's unofficial gatekeepers, and their confidence grew from the fact that, more often than not, no one challenged them. When they spotted Kelvin in the parking lot that day, their behavior followed a familiar script. A lone man, unfamiliar to them, and one who didn't fit into their view of who should be in their town. This was all it took to draw their attention. What began as murmurs and shared glances quickly shifted into something more deliberate. To them, this was just another moment to flex their dominance, a routine they had perfected. But what they didn't know was that their usual game of intimidation was about to collide with someone who wasn't playing by their rules. And the man they had chosen to confront wasn't just passing through, he was prepared for anything they could throw his way. The air in the parking lot shifted the moment Kelvin stepped out of his car. The Iron Bandits, parked a few spaces away, caught sight of him almost immediately. Clint Ramsey, leaning against his bike, was the first to notice. His gaze sharpened as he exchanged glances with Ray and Joel, a smirk forming on his face. To them, Kelvin was an intruder in their territory, and that was all the justification they needed. Their voices started low, just loud enough to be heard over the sound of idling engines, a muttered comment followed by laughter, then another, a pattern that was all too familiar to Kelvin. He didn't need to hear every word to know what they were saying. He had faced men like this before, men who thought strength came from numbers and that intimidation could substitute for courage. Clint's voice cut through the parking lot, louder now, deliberate. "Hey, didn't know we were giving tours today," he called out, his tone dripping with mockery. The others chuckled, their confidence growing as they fed off one another. Kelvin didn't react. He simply closed the car door and adjusted his jacket, his movements measured and calm. For a moment, his lack of response seemed to irritate them more than if he had engaged. As Kelvin began walking toward the diner, Clint stepped forward, blocking his path. "Where you headed, friend?" he asked, the word friend carrying anything but friendliness. Kelvin paused, meeting Clint's gaze without flinching. His expression remained neutral, his voice steady. "Just here for a bite to eat. Is that a problem?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. The question seemed to catch Clint off guard for a split second, but he recovered quickly. "Problem? Nah," Clint said, leaning slightly closer. "Just don't see many folks like you around here. Thought maybe you were lost." The others laughed, their voices echoing in the quiet of the lot. Kelvin didn't blink. He simply shifted his weight slightly, his posture relaxed but unyielding. "I know exactly where I am," he replied. The bikers exchanged glances, their amusement tempered by something they couldn't quite place. There was something about Kelvin's presence that unsettled them, though they would never admit it. His calmness, his refusal to be provoked, stood in stark contrast to their brashness. But instead of backing off, Clint doubled down. "You sure you want to stick around? Some places don't take kindly to strangers," he said, his voice carrying a warning. Kelvin let a beat pass before answering, his tone even but resolute. "I've been to a lot of places. Never had trouble fitting in before." His words were simple, but there was weight behind them, an unspoken challenge that hung in the air. Clint's smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly masked it with a laugh. "Well, you've got guts, I'll give you that," he said, his words meant to sound casual but landing hollow. As the tension built, Kelvin didn't budge. He didn't need to. His calm, composed demeanor said everything that needed to be said. The bikers, so accustomed to seeing their taunts met with fear or anger, were left with no easy target. They had no idea that the man standing before them had been trained to handle far greater threats than they could ever pose. And in the silence that followed, it became clear that this confrontation was far from over. The parking lot grew quieter, but the silence wasn't calm. It was charged, every glance, every movement heavy with tension. The bikers stood in a loose semicircle now, their casual demeanor giving way to something sharper. Clint took a step closer to Kelvin, his boots scraping against the gravel. "You think you're some kind of tough guy, huh?" he said, his tone laced with a challenge. His followers, emboldened by his presence, closed ranks behind him. Kelvin didn't flinch. He simply stood there, his gaze steady and unwavering. He'd been here before, different faces, different places, but the same energy. Men like Clint didn't know how to handle someone who wouldn't play their game, who wouldn't give them the reaction they were looking for. But Kelvin knew exactly what to do. He always did. Clint reached out, jabbing a finger toward Kelvin's chest, the gesture meant to provoke. "You don't look like you belong here," he said, his voice louder now, the words meant to draw a crowd. Ray and Joel chuckled behind him, their laughter hollow but menacing. Kelvin's hand moved, almost imperceptibly pushing Clint's hand aside. It wasn't aggressive. It was deliberate, controlled, and final. "Touching me's not a good idea," Kelvin said, his voice low but firm, his eyes locking onto Clint's. There was no threat in his words, just a statement of fact. For a moment, Clint hesitated, the force of Kelvin's calm unsettling him, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "You think you're better than me?" Clint said, stepping even closer, his tone daring Kelvin to react. The first shove came quickly, and it wasn't subtle. Joel, the largest of the group, stepped forward, pushing Kelvin hard enough to make a point, but not enough to escalate fully. Kelvin stumbled back slightly, catching himself with ease. The bikers laughed, their voices ringing out in the still air. But Kelvin didn't respond the way they expected. He straightened, his expression unchanged, his stance now just slightly wider, his balance unshakable. "You've had your fun," Kelvin said, his tone even but resolute. "Now let me get on with my day." His calmness only fueled their frustration. Men like Clint thrived on control, on seeing fear in their targets, and Kelvin wasn't giving them an inch. The second shove came from Ray, who stepped in, his hand gripping Kelvin's shoulder with force. This time Kelvin moved. His hand shot up, grabbing Ray's wrist with precision and applying just enough pressure to make him stop in his tracks. It was quick, almost too quick, for the others to fully register. Ray yelped, his bravado evaporating as Kelvin released him just as suddenly as he had grabbed him. "You should listen when someone tells you to stop," Kelvin said, his voice measured. Clint's smirk faded as he watched. Something about Kelvin's movement, his composure, didn't sit right. This wasn't the reaction of an ordinary man caught off guard. There was control here, discipline, something Clint couldn't quite place, but it made his confidence falter. "What's your deal?" Clint barked, his voice now tinged with something less certain. Kelvin didn't answer. Instead, he took a step back, his hands open, non-threatening, but his stance firm. He didn't need to say anything. The bikers were beginning to realize that this wasn't going the way they'd planned. Then Clint made his final mistake. He lunged forward, his hand reaching out in a clumsy attempt to grab Kelvin by the collar. And that's when everything shifted. In one fluid motion, Kelvin moved out of the way, his body turning with precision. He caught Clint's arm mid-lunge, guiding his momentum downward and off balance. Clint hit the ground hard, his breath knocked out of him. It wasn't a punch, it wasn't even a strike. It was control, pure and absolute. The others froze, their confidence now replaced with something else entirely. They looked at Kelvin, realizing for the first time that they might have underestimated the man they'd tried to intimidate. Kelvin adjusted his jacket, his movements deliberate, and for the first time, he spoke in a way that left no room for doubt. "You think you're tough because you've got numbers," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. "But you've never seen real toughness." His words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They carried the unshakable certainty of a man who had nothing to prove but everything under control. And in that moment, Clint and his crew saw it. The composure, the confidence, the way Kelvin carried himself. This wasn't just a man passing through town. This was someone they didn't understand, someone they couldn't intimidate. For the first time, it dawned on them that the game they'd been playing wasn't theirs to win. The parking lot was still now, the sounds of engines fading into the background as the weight of what had just occurred hung in the air. Clint sat on the ground, stunned, his bravado stripped away, replaced by an uneasy realization. Ray and Joel, once so eager to follow his lead, now stood frozen, exchanging uneasy glances. The laughter that had filled the space minutes earlier was gone, replaced by silence. Kelvin, standing tall, adjusted his jacket and looked around. His movements were deliberate but unthreatening. He could have walked away, left them to their embarrassment, but that wasn't who he was. Walking away from this moment would mean letting an opportunity pass, a chance to turn confrontation into something greater. He knew he had their attention now, and he intended to use it. He spoke calmly, his voice steady but firm. "You think strength is about who you can intimidate," he said, his gaze moving from Clint to the others. "But strength is in control. It's in knowing when to fight and when to walk away. You all should think about that." His words weren't angry or condescending. They carried a tone of quiet authority, one earned through years of discipline and service. Clint struggled to his feet, brushing off the dust from his jeans. His pride still stung, but the defiance in his eyes was gone, replaced by confusion, and perhaps a trace of respect. For once, he didn't have a snarky comeback. Kelvin turned to him and continued, You're leaders in this town, whether you realize it or not. People see what you do and they follow your example. What kind of example are you setting? The words lingered, cutting through the tension. Kelvin didn't wait for a response. Instead, he walked calmly toward his car, leaving the bikers standing there, their usual dominance broken. But he wasn't finished. As he reached his car, he pulled out his phone and made a call, not to escalate the situation but to ensure there would be accountability. By the time local law enforcement arrived, the bikers were subdued. Kelvin explained the events in detail, sticking to the facts without exaggeration. The officers, surprised by the calm demeanor of the man reporting the incident, took his statement seriously. The bikers, now faced with the reality of their actions, had no choice but to cooperate. Clint muttered something about it being a misunderstanding, but even he didn't seem convinced by his own words. Word of the incident spread quickly through Brookhaven. In a town where tensions often went unspoken, this confrontation forced a conversation many had avoided for too long. At the diner, where the bikers once held court, locals began discussing what had happened, some questioning why such behavior had been tolerated for so long. For the black residents of the town, the story was both vindicating and inspiring, a rare moment where someone had stood up to those who wielded intimidation as a weapon. In the days that followed, Clint and his crew faced the consequences of their actions. Complaints against them that had long been ignored were revisited. Community leaders began to speak out, addressing the underlying issues that had allowed such behavior to persist. Change wasn't immediate, but it had begun. Kelvin, however, didn't linger in Brookhaven. For him, this wasn't about seeking recognition or applause. It was about doing what was right and using the skills he had honed over years of service to make an impact, even if it was in a small corner of the world. As he drove away, the town left in his rearview mirror, he carried with him the quiet satisfaction of knowing that strength isn't just in what you fight against. It's in what you stand for. And for Brookhaven, the encounter with Kelvin Cole was a moment that wouldn't be forgotten, a reminder that change often starts with a single person willing to stand tall and speak the truth, even when no one else will. Days after the incident in Brookhaven, Kelvin found himself in a local community center speaking to a group of young people. They sat in a semicircle, their faces attentive as he recounted the confrontation, not as a tale of triumph, but as a lesson. "The truth is," Kelvin began, his voice steady and measured, "it's easy to let anger define you when you're faced with prejudice. It's easy to let their words and actions pull you down to their level. But strength isn't just in standing your ground. It's in knowing when to rise above it." He shared his journey, not just of that day, but of a lifetime spent confronting the quiet and loud moments of racism, from schoolyards to battlefields, from sidewalks to parking lots. Kelvin spoke of the importance of resilience, not just for oneself, but for the generations watching, learning, and emulating. He reminded them that racism thrives on fear, ignorance, and silence, and the only way to break its grip was to stand firm with courage and compassion. "We don't fight hate with hate," he said, glancing around the room. "We fight it with strength, understanding, and action. And sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is show people who you are, without letting their perception of you change a thing." As he left the center, Kelvin reflected on the power of such moments, how even one encounter, one confrontation, could ripple outward, influencing others in ways he might never fully see. The parking lot in Brookhaven wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger story. And while the fight against prejudice wasn't over, Kelvin knew that every step forward, no matter how small, was progress worth making. This story is more than just an encounter in a parking lot. It's a reminder that prejudice, though persistent, can be challenged and dismantled when met with courage, resilience, and understanding. Kelvin Cole's actions that day serve as an inspiration to us all, to stand firm in the face of discrimination and to lead with integrity and strength. If you believe in equality, justice, and the power of standing up against hate, We encourage you to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to this channel for more stories that matter. Together we can amplify voices, inspire change, and promote the values that unite us all.